Welcome to the latest version of our lessons from leaders. And to remind those of you who may have missed yesterday, in these moderated presentations, different education directors and leaders from other organizations share their insights and how they've transformed their grassroots momentum into coalitions that advance real change. So today we're going to hear from Dr. Sarah-SoonLing Blackburn, who's the Associate Director for Learning in Schools at one of my favorite organizations, Learning for Justice, which is a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And she'll be discussing the work that they have for teachers on creating inclusive classrooms that center social justice and catalyze action. It's work that I have found incredibly relevant for my own teaching. And I believe that it does a lot of great work for teachers who are interested in social justice issues. So welcome, Sarah. It's so great to have you here. And I would love to hear you share with us a little bit more about some of the work that you're doing after I give a little bit more on the fact that you not only are the Associate Director, but you also have teaching experience at both the secondary and elementary levels. And you have an MA in Social Justice and Education from University College London's Institute of Education, and an EDD from my neighbor institution here in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University. And you are currently based out of Oxford, Mississippi. So thank you so much for joining us, and would love to hear a little bit of an overview of your work there.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thank you so much. Namely, hello from Oxford, where it is very hot, and I don't think my air conditioning is working right now. So if I'm a little sweaty and flustered, please forgive me and understand, but it's really nice to be with all of you here today. So Stephanie really did cover a lot of what we do at Learning for Justice already. We are a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which was established in 1971 and really works to advance social justice, human rights, and particularly racial justice across the Deep South and the nation. Learning for Justice started in 1991 with the realization that this work really matters with young people, that understanding how to create an inclusive society really starts with creating inclusive spaces for all people, including the youngest of us, providing resources for educators, providing supports and trainings in order to advance and realize some of those visions for justice that the broader organization has. Many of you might know us more by our former name, which was Teaching Tolerance, but we changed our name just about not even a year and a half ago in early 2021 to Learning for Justice. And I'm really excited about that shift. So I used to travel around and do workshops about our materials as Teaching Tolerance. And people would always say, I love this stuff, but what's with the name, or why just tolerance? And I think that's a really fair point, right? We are increasingly recognizing that simply tolerating difference is not usually enough. We want acceptance, we want inclusion, we want belonging, we want justice. So Learning for Justice much better captures that mission. And then also this shift from teaching tolerance to learning for justice also signals that change towards we are all learning together all the time, including those of us who work at Learning for Justice, including veteran educators, including the newest people entering into our field, including people who just support education in all of the different ways that people do. We envision this work in four main, what we call critical practice areas. We focus on curriculum and instruction. So we provide lesson plans, film kits, other free resources. You can check out the link in the chat box. If you do not currently subscribe to Learning for Justice, please sign up there. Our magazine is wonderful. Our newsletters are, again, all free, and you can use them, you can share them. We also work in culture and climate, so specifically school culture, classroom culture, school climate, things like speaking up against bias and injustice, strategies for having, what we call sometimes critical conversations or challenging conversations about topics like identity, about topics like, what Isaac was saying earlier about not talking down to our students, about some of the real challenging things that are happening in the world. We also provide resources around family and community engagement, recognizing that there's not necessarily a divide between school and the real world, the way that sometimes we talk about. And then if our last area is leadership, recognizing again that all of us have more to learn. We all lead in various ways, whether we are a classroom teacher, whether we are at a school district level, whether we work outside of the traditional school context, we all have leadership, including students as well. So providing supports, trainings, resources in all of those areas. And yeah, check out the website for more.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's again, I can't underscore enough how influential your work has been for the work that I do, and much of it does overlap with a lot of the kind of critical media literacy that I teach teachers about. So my opening question to you is really for you to kind of tell me what matters most to you in regards to this work. And so, like, what are you doing to kind of continue to advance it, and how might those of us in the media literacy world help you?
Yeah, I have a Post-it note right here. I'll show it to you. So I have this Post-it note that says it's about belonging, which is something that I've been focused on specifically recently, because belonging looks different and feels different to all people, right? What does it mean to feel like you can be in a place where you can be who you are, all of who you are in a place that is a, sometimes we think of like, oh, it's just like really touchy-feely or not that important, but it's such a critical component of success as a human, whether that's academic success or, we talk about social emotional learning, all of these different areas that we care about in education. At the end of the day, if you don't feel like you can be who you are and all of who you are, then it really doesn't matter how, excellent that test prep course is that you've had, or it doesn't matter, if you have the newest technology in your hands, because there's going to be a disengagement. So a lot of what we do is focus on that piece of inclusion and belonging, and recognizing that that isn't just about, making everyone feel good and happy all the time. Sometimes it's about hard truths, or sometimes it's about confronting injustice. There's an educator who was in a workshop with me once who said, you can't talk about social justice without talking about social injustice. And that really stuck out to me, right? You have to confront the issues head on in order to recognize just how maybe untrue or how harmful they are. And then in order to dismantle them, in order to move past them to this more just world or more just society that we're looking towards.
So it's really kind of acknowledging the truths. A lot of that we discussed in some of our sessions yesterday. Our keynote yesterday morning with Ken Shelton had us thinking about mirrors and windows. And so that reminds me of some of that kind of conversation. And again, the materials that you all have with this idea of belonging and front and center are really incredibly crucial. But as you mentioned about justice and injustice and those difficult conversations, I'm sure that sometimes the people that may find their way to your materials, they may have different interests or desires and beliefs of where the movement should go and how it gets there. So how do you all navigate that when you do kind of encounter some of those complicated interactions?
That is a really good question. And if you have a great answer to it, then I want to learn from you too, because it's something we're always navigating. I think that first, that shift towards learning for justice was a really big change. The whole theme of this conference is level up. And I feel like that was a major moment of leveling up as an organization, recognizing that we needed to stand for what we believe should be true in the world, and that what we believe should be true is a just society for all people, particularly seeking justice for those who have been traditionally marginalized or left out of the mainstream of the opportunities of, and in our education realm, of that access to education that we think people need in order to thrive. And that was really helpful, right? Because once you really stake your claim in what you think needs to be true, and backing that up again with research, with understanding, and like listening to constituencies, that helps you also then say, okay, this is where we draw some lines sometimes, right? So I've had times where I was asked to go speak, and they'll say, you know, this is great, come talk about social justice, talk about education, share your resources and materials. You're not allowed to mention gender equality, for example, or you're not allowed to talk about sexual orientation. And I have worked at other justice-oriented organizations in the past that have said, okay, well, it's really important that you show up, you know, just modify your remarks, or like, you know, pull that page out of the handout and go anyway. But when we say, no, this is what we believe to be true, it allows us to draw some of those lines and say, actually, if a kid isn't allowed to be all of who they are, that is not justice, right? So I'm not going to go and not speak about this one thing. You know, we can kind of work through that and have that tough conversation. But I think it's really important to note that this idea of like agreeing to disagree has that limit of when somebody's identity or somebody's humanity is being like called into question somehow. And yeah, it's tough, right? Because we have a lot of people who access our resources who have a lot of different opinions about things. But the central question that I find myself asking most days, asking of myself, asking of people I work with, is whose perspectives are we centering? Whose perspectives are we privileging? Whose perspectives are we listening to the most? But are we centering the perspectives of the people who are most often at the margins? And if not, why not? And oftentimes that question brings the clarity that we need to make the decision to move forward.
So what advice, to extend from that, do you give to teachers to help them to do the same sort of work that you're talking about, where you really don't, you know, sacrifice the controversies?
Yeah, that is a even more critical question right now. There are so many teachers who I'm hearing from on a daily basis saying, you know, I'm concerned about parent outcry about things that I'm talking about, or I've been asked not to teach this book anymore. And there's this real chilling effect that has been described in many places that many people in our profession are feeling. One good piece of news is that in a couple months, hopefully sooner, we will be publishing a new guide called Advocating for Teaching Honest History, What Educators Can Do, which does focus mostly on history education, but I think it's applicable, you know, across the spectrum, because it really is things like letting student voices lead the conversation, right? So rather than saying, here's my stance, here's what I believe, blah, 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 saying, here, we're going to have a conversation about this. Here are some sort of safeguards I'm putting around the conversation. I want it to be a safer conversation. I don't believe that there's always, it's not always possible to have a completely safe conversation, but a safer or braver conversation. And letting students say, here's something I found, here's a resource. You know, we're talking about media literacy in teens earlier with what Isaac was saying. Oftentimes kids are finding things online, letting them bring those in and having the conversation around that. And as the educator, being there to kind of support and guide and facilitate the conversation, and letting our administrators, letting parents, letting other people know along the way, hey, this is a thing that's coming up in my students. I want to provide a space for them to discuss it, so that it isn't kind of this reactive thing that's happening later where something is misconstrued or misunderstood, that by being sort of transparent on the front end and providing space. You know, a lot of times people are actually really glad that these conversations are happening in school, because that is where they can happen in a safer, more facilitated way than other places that they might be talking about or encountering these materials anyway.
It sounds like an excellent resource, and you have to just make sure that we all are able to share that out once it's released, because
Absolutely.
I think it'll be incredibly beneficial to a lot of teachers. Will you do training surrounding this document that's coming out?
Yes, and you can actually sign up for the virtual trainings right now on our website. If you go there and go to professional development, and then I believe it's under open enrollments. I always have our website pulled up, so I'm looking over here to see what it's under. No, it's under workshops. So if you go to that website, professional development workshops, you can actually sign up now to reserve a spot for our fall virtual professional learning sessions. These are interactive. They're fairly small group. They are facilitated by Learning for Justice professional learning facilitators. And we'll be offering ones around that workshop, as well as some of our other, offering ones around that resource, as well as some of our other more popular and also most sort of broadly applicable publications that we have available.
So in terms of this idea of leveling up, this particular document you were mentioning has to do with teaching history. And so I guess the question is, you know, in a pursuit to sort of level up and grow and move, quote unquote, forward, to what extent is it important to kind of think about history and think about what came before us?
I think, I mean, it's cliche to say perhaps, but if we don't learn from our history, we're doomed to repeat it. And so much of what is happening in our world right now is not new. It is just the newest version of the thing that is happening. You know, it might be different based on location, time, context, culture. And yet, if we don't have access to that history, we are going to continue to have the same injustices, the same inequities and inequalities that have existed beforehand. I think a lot, so I'll speak from my very personal experience right now. I think a lot about the Asian American experience and how little I learned about that in school growing up. So I learned nothing about laws that restricted how many Asian people could be in a room together at the same time because of fears of spreading disease in the 1800s. I learned nothing about mass killings and acts of violence against Asian American people, you know, around that same time period. And because I didn't have access to that knowledge, I didn't really understand what was happening today with a rise in hatred against, you know, Asian, especially East Asian people. I didn't know that there was this long historical legacy, and that was why it was so quickly reactivated, these old stereotypes that existed. So that's just one quick example from my own personal experience, but you can just expand and extrapolate that outwards, that there are so many thousands and thousands of examples that are very similar to that. And, you know, it's also really important that young people have access to that information, because that allows them to better navigate and understand the world around them. There are times where kids don't understand why something is happening. Why is somebody looking at them in a certain way, or talking to them one way and talking to somebody else a different way? And it's because of these sort of broader historical structural ideas that we almost have this like reproduced amnesia around sometimes. And by trusting that they can handle, you know, age appropriate, but that they can handle sort of accurate information about history, about human difference, about identity, diversity, justice, they are better able to then take action to help to kind of dismantle many of these systems that have been in place for so long.
Yeah, to that point regarding the age appropriateness, how does that conversation take place at Learning for Justice in terms of creating materials? Someone in the chat asked what levels you have materials for.
Yeah, one of our foundational resources is called our social justice standards. You can just search, you know, Learning for Justice social justice standards, or even just search social justice standards, you'll probably find them. These are 20 outcomes for what it would mean for a young person to sort of have a deep understanding around 4 areas that I mentioned earlier: identity, diversity, justice, and action. Our social justice standards are written with different grade level band outcomes. So there are standards, there's the same standards, but it shows what they look like in K through 2, 3 through 5, 6 through 8, and then 9 through 12. I've worked with people like yourself who work in higher education, training teachers who also use those standards with their students. I work with administrators who use those standards with staff development, because I recognize, looking at these, there are some in the elementary grade bands that I'm not very good at. And it's because I didn't have practice, right? So having that, that sort of broken down by age level standard really helps us to scaffold up, recognizing that, okay, when I'm talking in kindergarten, I might not be using terms like intersectionality, with a 5-year-old, but I can say something about identity is I am, all of who I am. I love all of the parts of me, right? That is a more age appropriate way of getting towards that concept. And then as it grows, it adds in more vocabulary and kind of complexity to the same standard.
That's really important because I know, having been in media literacy for a while and teaching elements of social justice, it's oftentimes the more difficult kind of demographic, to working with early elementary teachers about how to make these types of topics age appropriate. So to level up, it seems important for us to kind of maybe put a spotlight on the earlier grades to kind of think about ways of making that kind of conversation more developmentally appropriate. And I like the way that you talk about the need for changing the language to make it more accessible for the younger grades. So that's wonderful. Another question, I guess, in terms of thinking of student populations, is there ever an attention at Learning for Justice for students with disabilities in a particular way? Are there materials that kind of are geared for them?
Yes, you can. So on the main website, if you scroll down, you'll see a list of topic areas. One of the topics is ability. So we do provide resources in that way. We are working on trying to make our materials more accessible. So things like upgrading the website, it actually looks different today than it did yesterday to me. And I think it's because some of these upgrades are happening in real time to try to make some of these materials more accessible. And I know there's more that we can do. So for example, we have a text library. So for all of you on here who are looking for texts for students to use, these are free. All you need is a free login to access these. You can use them in your classroom. There are hundreds of texts around a whole bunch of topics that you can search and use. Our lower elementary texts have an accompanying audio file. So you can listen to a read aloud, right, which is great. But I also recognize we don't yet have that for the older grade levels. So kind of working on Learning for Justice is actually a very, very small organization. I think there are fewer than 20 of us who are there full time. Wow. And so there is this push and pull between, as we're trying to be more accessible to all types of people, where do we start? Where is the critical need? And I'm sure that many of you who are listening in today are also wrestling with that balance. And again, it brings us back to that question, whose perspectives are we centering? So realizing that we have found more of that need in the lower elementary grades, that's where we started first, and then kind of working upwards helps to kind of make these decisions because otherwise it's really challenging.
Yeah, that's important to hear. And I can't believe your staff is so small because your materials are so abundant. So it's amazing. Kudos to you for that. Now, I mean, I appreciate the idea of you kind of keeping in mind for yourself this idea of belonging. But I wonder how else your organization keeps your narrative focused on its mission and outcome, but still addresses these variety of perspectives and understandings that accompany the work. What do you actually do as an organization in that regard?
That's a really great question. One, following the lead of the Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC, and that commitment towards justice, particularly racial justice, particularly in the Deep South, that is an important just a framework for us to work within. Traditionally, in the past, Teaching Tolerance provided a lot of wonderful material. So we had our magazine, we had our website, we had all these lesson plans out there. And it really was a, come find it kind of thing. So people would might make their way to us. We would send out mailings kind of broadly. We'd find, let's send this to every school and let's see which teacher picks this up who's interested in it. Maybe they'll subscribe and keep coming. And of course, what you find with that is often your audience is people who are, one, already interested in these topics and having these conversations. Two, your audience is people who feel equipped or empowered to do that work sort of with whatever the conditions are that they're already existing in. So again, speaking for myself, I taught most recently at a rural school, 3rd grade in Quitman County, Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta, which is not too far from where I live now here in Oxford. And I'll be honest, I had never heard of teaching tolerance. I'd never heard of learning for justice. And that is because a lot of my more pressing needs were things like making sure my classroom didn't flood every time it rained, trying to pull materials and resources because it was really difficult to always have a quality lesson with what we had. We had amazing staff, amazing school leadership, and yet I wasn't at home going, wow, I wonder what's out there about, social justice, because there were all of these sort of, we're talking about like Maslow's hierarchy, right? We're like all of these basic needs that I was trying to just navigate through on a day-to-day basis. So one thing we're doing at Learning for Justice now is really shifting that focus. We still have all of these materials for people who can come to us and find these webinars that anyone can sign up for, and working on building out more targeted, specific support for educators who often have been kind of blocked out of having that. In the past, when I was traveling and doing workshop for different schools, we charged very little. It was mostly just to cover my transportation and hotel stay for the workshop, but that is still a barrier to entry to many schools. That still would have been too much for the schools I taught in to get. So how are we making sure we are putting ourselves in proximity to the educators, to the contexts that need that support, and recognize that what we have sort of out here is still going to be able to serve the needs of the audience that we have, that we don't have to treat them as two separate things. We're either going deep in one place or going wide everywhere else, that actually by going deep in one place, we're able to then create better quality materials that we can disseminate all over the place.
Yeah, and kind of to that point, it's also just a really, like you're mentioning, some pragmatic issues in terms of getting this sort of information to teachers. And I don't know how the pandemic has affected the work that you do, but I know one of the discussions we've had here at Namely is the idea of having our conferences available and in an online capacity, which initially was as a result of the pandemic. But what we've realized is that we can reach more teachers this way, because of the fact that they don't have to they don't have to pay to travel. And so I don't know how the pandemic has impacted the leveling up that you all have intended to do over the last few years.
100% the same. I didn't do a workshop for educators in my state of Mississippi until we went remote, which is, and I live here, right? It could have been easy for me to drive down the street and do a workshop. And yet, because of all those things we mentioned, it was never happening. And then once we went online, without having to, sometimes teachers have to pay for their own substitute. They have to, take that day off, pay for travel, all of those things. There's so many barriers beyond just the time that I hadn't necessarily thought about beforehand. And that's something that, is not going to go away. So we made that pivot to virtual PD, and we're going to make sure that we keep that, even as we hopefully build back in these in-person learning experiences. Making sure to have those accessible virtual components is super important, to the points that you mentioned before. More people can access it, and that's hugely important.
Yeah, for sure. So that's good to hear that you all have found that that's a successful way to engage. What role do you think that individual educators play then in movement building? I mean, thinking to what your story was about your own experiences, and I know plenty of those teachers who just are so, caught up in the daily grind of teaching that it is hard for them to do this so-called movement building. But yet at the same time, we talk about it in our program, the grad program that I direct, about, in a sense, it's like a civic responsibility for teachers to try to do this. But I don't know what you all discuss in terms of the roles that individual educators can play in movement building.
Yeah, I love that idea of it being a civic responsibility. One thing I think it's important to note is that being part of movement building doesn't have to look the same for all people. So sometimes we look at these like famous figureheads or these big names, and we go, wow, if I'm not doing it like that, if I'm not always out there on the front lines, then I'm not part of it. Now, there are people, and I know many of them and love them dearly, who are that person who wants to be out there on the front lines every time. And I love and admire those people very much. But I relate to many people in the chat. Believe it or not, I am also a very big introvert. And so, this drains me, right? Doing a lot of these conversations and things over time can be very challenging. I need to retreat and recognize that there are other things that I can do. So I can share materials, I can curate resources that I have found helpful, share those out with educators, and that makes a big difference. I can bring people with me. I can say, hey, I'm going to this learning experience. I want you to come and just listen together. So I have a good friend. Sometimes we create a shared Google Doc. And so we'll be doing sort of an online lecture together in two totally different states. And we're both taking notes in the same document so that we can process together at the same time, which is wonderful because then I can see how she's planning to apply it in the future. So there's so many little ways that we can still actively engage, but I think it's important that we do. Sometimes teachers say to me, like, I really care about this work matters, but I don't feel like I know enough, or I didn't study this in school, I don't understand yet. To which point I say that's okay. And there is also no such thing as knowing all of it. There is no point where you've mastered justice or like mastered history. And part of that is recognizing that learning transparently with our students is also a big part of being part of movement building, because we're modeling for them how to engage in that ongoing process of learning. So again, it's like all of these different things that we can do, but as long as we keep that peace in our minds and in our hearts, what do we want to be true? What do we want to be true for our students? What do we want to be true for our society? That will really help you figure out and guide you towards what is your role within that broader picture.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I really like that a lot in terms of thinking about, it's like almost a spectrum of involvement that we all can engage in to build a movement. And I mean, another example that comes to my mind that I believe you all have, like some materials that are for this, is even just doing an equity audit in your own classroom is something that can build a movement, to just see what materials you're using. And we had discussions about this yesterday a little bit in some of our discussions. So do you have materials specifically that could help people kind of think about what practice is or what materials they're engaged in that could help to enhance equity?
Yes, so my favorite resource that we have, it's a publication called Critical Practices. Right now it's called Critical Practices for Anti-Bias Education. We are working on a revision of it, so it's actually going to come out hopefully soon, which will be Critical Practices for Social Justice Education. But it lists very concrete things that educators can do in those 4 areas that I named earlier: curriculum and instruction, classroom culture, family and community engagement, and teacher leadership. And part of it, especially in the culture and climate one, they do have some suggestions on a classroom audit. But it's things like, create an identity map for yourself. So who you are, some of your social identities around it. And then think about, which of these identities are what we would consider dominant or centered in our mainstream society, which ones may be more marginalized, and how does that affect what materials you're using in your classroom? So think about what's on the walls, what books you have, what other resources you have, the layout of your room. What are some of the things that you maybe think about a lot and some that you might not think about as often? So I recognize that I think, because of my own identity, I think about racial identity a lot. I don't think about ability as often because I am able-bodied, because I'm neurotypical. And so I have to kind of push myself to think about that and recognize where I'm including that in my classroom. And that's the kind of thing that doing that process of an equity audit can help you to recognize. I see a question in the chat. So the name of the publication is Critical Practices for Anti-Bias Education. And it's a PDF. I'll pull it up as Stephanie's talking.
Well, I mean, the other thing that I think that we kind of share is a big emphasis on, though you have these different areas, this curriculum and instruction kind of emphasis of teaching and advocacy also. I think a piece that I wonder about periodically is how we can have school administrators and school administration kind of work in tangent with those of us trying to movement build. And so are there focused materials that you all have developed at Learning for Justice that help school leaders, whether at the school level or at the district levels, to kind of also support teachers and other, social justice advocates, if you will.
That's an area that we really want to build out. Right now, we have one publication that really speaks to that audience. It's called Responding to Hate and Bias at School, and it mostly focuses on both preventing hate incidents or bias incidents in a school, but also what to do when if and when they happen, how to respond afterwards and follow up. So that is one of our school climate or district climate resources. But we're hoping to have more than that specifically speak to that audience, because that is a main concern that we get from educators. We did some listening circles with teachers, classroom teachers recently, to hear, what are your concerns? What are the barriers that you're feeling right now? And as we know in the research, administrative support has a huge impact on teachers' perception of their work. So if you are a school leader, how are you listening to the educators in your context? How are you being that support for people who feel like they have that supportive leader? They felt so much more empowered than people who didn't. And I think that's a critical audience to engage as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, in terms of thinking about leveling up, that really is kind of a needed area. And I think if we listen back to this recording, we can almost take these wonderful notes to kind of share with each other to see about a way to grow a movement. So what a wonderful discussion this has been, to be able to help us think about how we can grow. You've really offered us some wonderful advice,